Welcome to another installment of Fireside Bible Stories. This is a collection of stories from the Old Testament mainly that you may not hear preached in church on Sunday morning, but they're still very real stories from the Bible that hold very real lessons for our lives. This is a third installment in a series on the book of Judges. And tonight we're going to meet a new character that has a very old enemy.
Shh! Do you want to wake the whole Midianite army?
Gideon and his servant Purah were on a covert mission to scout out the enemy. The angel of the Lord had told them that they would seem more numerous than a plague of locusts. He'd undersold it. Gideon had never seen so many people in one place in all of his life. Maybe he should have just done what the Lord had told him. Rush into battle without sizing up the Midianites first. But that's the problem with an omniscient God. He knew how apprehensive Gideon was about the prospect of fighting a battle without taking stock of whether he could win or not. As they snuck closer to the camp, Gideon heard voices coming from a nearby tent. I had a dream, and in it there was a cake of barley bread tumbling into our camp, right into this tent. And it hit the side and fell upside down, and the tent collapsed. There was confusion in the voice and a tinge of fear. Another voice answered. It had to be Jerubbaal, the son of Joash, the sword of Israel. Their God has given all of Midian into his hand. That's the great thing about serving an omniscient God. Not only had he given Gideon the confidence that he so desperately needed, but he even threw in a couple of Easter egg reminders about the conversation that Gideon had had with the Lord. Easter egg reminders that would even make Marvel movie fans excited. Israel had once again done evil in the sight of the Lord. They'd once again turned to foreign idolatry, and as a result, the Midianites had overwhelmed them. They really were like a plague of locusts. Israel was unable to grow any food for themselves because the Midianites and their Amalekite allies would swarm in and strip the crops bare, leaving nothing for the Israelites. It was the same with the livestock. Israel was starving. They had to hide in the rocks and cliff sides to escape this plague of Midianite locusts, which has made farming and raising livestock difficult, if not impossible. But when the people of Israel collectively cried out to God to save them, he responded. But not in the way that the elders expected. Gideon was the youngest son of Joash, the Abiezrite. One day Gideon was out beating a stalk of wheat at a secret wine press that was hidden from the Midianites in his hometown of Ophrah. As he was at his work, a strange man came, and he sat under a great oak tree there. Gideon didn't recognize this man, so he was a little leery of him being there. He looked like an Israelite, but he could be a Midianite spy. The man sat and stared at Gideon working for a short time, but that silent tension made the short time seem like an eternity to Gideon. Just as he was about to shout, "Take a picture, it'll last longer," the stranger spoke. "The Lord is with you, you mighty warrior." Gideon looked around a little confused. Who's he talking to? He answered, "If the Lord is with us, then why is this happening to us? Where are his wonderful deeds that we hear about all the time? He can bring us out of Egypt, but he can't protect us from Midian." The stranger responded, You're angry. Good. You're going to use that to deliver Israel. I'm commissioning you to gather and lead the army that will defeat the Midianites and rescue Israel. As he said all this, a strange feeling came over Gideon. This was no stranger. This was the messenger of the Lord. And the words he spoke seemed to be the words of God himself. And strangely enough, everything about this man seemed to just embody the words and speech of God. How can I? Gideon asked. My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I'm the least in my family. The stranger answered, I am with you. That is all that you will need. You will strike down the Midianites, every single one. Gideon had grown up with the Midianite religion. It was all he knew in practice. There were stories of the God of Israel, but they'd been just that, stories. So Gideon asked him, will you show me a sign? I don't mean to be disrespectful, but I need to know for sure. Will you wait right here while I bring you a gift? And the stranger who spoke the words of God patiently agreed. Gideon returned a short time later with a prepared goat, some broth, and some unleavened barley cakes, just like what the Midianite soldier had seen in his dream. The stranger instructed him to lay out the goat meat and the unleavened cakes on some rocks and to pour out the broth on the ground. And once he'd done that, the stranger reached out his staff, which strangely resembled a shepherd's staff. He reached out his staff and he touched the meat and the cakes, and fire immediately sprang up from the rock, and the meat and the cakes were consumed. And in that instant, the stranger was gone. Now Gideon was worried. Help me, Lord, for I've seen the angel of the Lord face to face. Gideon heard a voice that at the same time seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. And it said, peace be to you. Do not fear. You will not die. Gideon built an altar to the Lord on that very spot in Ophrah and called it the Lord is Peace. That night the voice returned to Gideon and instructed him very specifically to take his father's second bull of 7 years and use it to pull down his father's altar to Baal and cut down his father's sacred Asherah pole and to build an altar of the Lord on that spot. Then use this idolatrous refuse to make a fire and sacrifice the bull as a burnt offering. Now this was a big deal. This was the Baal and the Asherah shrine for the city, so Gideon was a little bit apprehensive. He did it, but he waited until the cover of darkness to do it. And when the people woke up in the morning and they saw what had happened, they were furious. First they grumbled and complained. But as soon as they discovered that it was Joash's own son, Gideon, the baby of the family, they were out for blood. Within a short time, they were calling for Gideon's head. And Joash answered their cries for blood with a question. Does Baal need you to fight his battles for him, or does he need you to do his dirty work? I say that whoever does anything on Baal's behalf this morning will be put to death. If Baal doesn't like that, he can come and take that up with me. That day, Gideon earned the name Jerubbaal. Let Baal fight for him, for it is his altar that was pulled down. He was the bane of Baal. The Midianites had gotten wind of this smart-aleck kid that had destroyed an altar site and incited a group of Israelites to turn from Baal and Asherah. And a large army of Midianites and Amalekites were headed to Ophrah to make an example out of Jerubbaal and his people. And on the way, just for good measure, they stopped at the city of Tabor, and they wiped it out before making camp in the valley of Jezreel, the valley where Barak had slaughtered the army of Sisera, the valley where, in years to come, the Philistines would one day defeat and kill King Saul, and the valley that will one day be the site of the worst battle in the history of the world, Armageddon. The Spirit of the Lord took hold of Gideon, and he summoned his tribe of Abizites and sent out word all through the lands of Manasseh. He also called on the tribes of Zebulun and Naphtali, the tribes that Barak had used to destroy Sisera. And as his army was amassing, Gideon still doubted. He asked the Lord for a sign. Lord, if it's your will that I'll be victorious, I'll lay out a fleece on the ground and show me that you're with me by wetting the fleece with dew, but leaving all the ground around it dry. In the morning, Gideon checked his test fleece, and sure enough, the ground was dry, but he needed a bucket to wring the dew out of the fleece. And again, Gideon asked God for another sign. He said, "Don't let your anger burn with me." And now remember, Gideon is just coming to know God, so he still needs to see if he can trust him. And Gideon said, "I'll lay out the fleece again, like the night before, but this time send the dew to the ground and leave the fleece dry." And again, God complied, and Gideon was convinced. His 31,000-man army gave his shaky faith a little extra reassurance, too. God spoke again to Gideon. "This army is too large. With this army, you'll wipe out the Midianites, but due to the advantage, Israel will say that they did this all on their own. Now go and tell the men that are afraid for their lives that they're released and send them home." So Gideon gathered the whole army and made the decree that any man that was fearful would be released to go back to his home. 21,000 men deserted, leaving only 10,000 in the army. Again, God spoke to Gideon. "This is still too many. Take your army to the water, and I'll show you who to keep and who to release." And when the men arrived at the watering hole, Gideon noticed that there seemed to be two types of men drinking from the river. Some crouched on their knees, and they scooped the water up to their mouths with their hands, all the while keeping their eyes on the horizon, always on guard, always ready. Other men kind of greedily laid flat on their stomachs and drank directly out of the stream with no regard for their safety. So Gideon thought that he could see where this is going, but he was dead wrong. God instructed him to gather up all the men that had remained cautious and alert. And this was an overwhelming majority of the army that was left. Gideon thought, "I can definitely work with these guys." But like God does, he turned all of Gideon's notions and ideas on their head. He said, these men that remained cautious and alert, they're the men that you'll dismiss." And once the men had dispersed, Gideon found that he was left with only 300. God instructed Gideon to collect all the jars and the torches and the trumpets from the men that were leaving and being sent home. He told him to collect all of these items and to be prepared. God was going to defeat the Midianites with just 300 men. When he told Gideon it was time to get ready, he needed to be ready to go. That night the Lord came to Gideon and told him that the time had come. "Gather the men quickly and go and attack the camp. But if you fear an attack, take your servant Purah down and hear what the Midianites are saying." And that's where we first met Gideon and Purah. The man in the tent said, "I had a dream, and in it a cake of barley bread tumbled into our camp right into the tent, and it hit the side and fell upside down, and the tent collapsed." There was confusion. and a tinge of fear in his voice. And another voice answered from within the tent. It had to be Jerubbaal, the son of Joash, the sword of Israel. God has given all of Midian into his hand. Gideon, possibly for the first time in earnest, worshiped God on the spot. Then he returned to the Israelite camp and rallied the troops. He divided the 300 into 3 separate companies and gave each man a jar, a torch, and a trumpet, and he instructed them to watch him and do just as he did. When I blow my trumpet, you all do likewise. Then shout at the top of your lungs for the Lord and for Gideon. Just as the middle watch was beginning in the Midianite camp, the 3 Israelite companies encircled the camp. The 300 all simultaneously threw down their jars and blew their trumpets, and then they shouted with one unified voice, a sword for the Lord and for Gideon. The Midianites panicked in the darkness, many being awoken by the startling cries and the trumpet blasts. And in the mass panic, the Midianites took up their arms, but in the confusion and darkness, they mistook friends for foes, and they began cutting one another down. Then another trumpet blast and shout. This sent the entire Midianite army into full retreat. Gideon and his men immediately took pursuit. Gideon sent messengers to the Israelite tribe of Ephraim to join the fight. The men of Ephraim seized the waters of Beth Barah and the Jordan River. They captured the Midianite captains, Oreb and Zeb. Oreb was killed at a site known from that point on as the Rock of Oreb, and Zeb likewise was killed at a place called the Winepress of Zeb. The Ephraimites delivered Oreb and Zeb's heads directly to Gideon. But when they presented their trophies to Gideon, they presented them with a complaint. Why didn't you include us in the fight with Midian? They were on the verge of getting violent in their complaint when Gideon responded, you have the honor of having killed Oreb and Zeb. Think how much better the wine is going to taste coming out of a wine press that killed a Midianite captain. You weren't even at the battle, but you got the highest honor. The technical term for gaining the highest honor without having to risk anything in the fight is a little something that the philosophers call a win-win situation, pal. Well, that satisfied the Ephraimites. But Gideon wasn't satisfied. He wasn't satisfied because the Midianite kings, Zalmunna and Zebah, were still at large. So he and his 300 men hunted them all over the land of Canaan. When they passed through the town of Sukkoth, the men were exhausted and hungry. When Gideon asked for food and shelter, the people of Sukkoth ridiculed his request derisively for not having captured the kings yet. Gideon narrowed his eyes and he said, I will trample your flesh with the thorns. He had a very similar experience in Penuel. When he was ridiculed there, he promised to destroy the tower of Penuel when he returned victorious. And Gideon had a bad habit of remembering things like this. When Gideon and his 300 finally caught Zebah and Zalmunna, the Midianites had lost approximately 125,000 men, but 15,000 remained. Even with those long odds, Gideon was able to take the Midianites off guard and rout them, capturing the 2 kings. In the thrill of his decisive victory, Gideon was still consumed with his newfound hatred for Sukkoth and Penuel. He took his victory roadshow the long way home to Ophrah through Sukkoth and Penuel. And as luck would have it, he caught a young man of Sukkoth just outside the city. And with his unique brand of persuasion, Gideon got the young man to divulge the names of the 77 elders of Sukkoth. And then Gideon did just what he told them he would. He covered them in thorns and briars, and he trampled them to death. He also remembered Penuel. Their crowning achievement was a grand tower, which Gideon had destroyed. Then he killed the men of that city. Don't cross a guy that defeats an entire empire with only 300 men. All of this destroying cities reminded Gideon of something that he'd been meaning to talk to the two kings about. He asked Zebah and Zalmunna if they remembered Tabor. Oh yeah, sure we do. Well, what do you remember about the people there? Now that you mention it, they had the looks of kings and princes. Come to think of it, some of them looked an awful lot like you. Gideon thoughtfully responded, "You don't say. That's because they were my brothers. If you'd left them alive, I would have done the same for you, but..." In an act of disrespect, Gideon ordered his young son, Jether, to kill the kings on the spot, but the boy, being very young, couldn't quite pull the trigger. So this prompted Zebah and Zalmunna to ridicule Gideon. I think we all know how that turned out. Gideon did the deed himself. And he probably made sure that the process was slow and it hurt the whole time that they were dying. Jerubbaal had defeated the Midianite overlords, and the people of Israel rejoiced. They demanded that he and his sons rule over the Israelites in perpetuity, but Gideon refused. He did, however, demand that each man of Israel give him one of the golden earrings that they'd taken as a trophy from the defeated Midianites. Then he took those earrings and melted them into a golden ephod, or a priestly vestment. And then he adorned that ephod with the purple clothes of the Midianite kings. Gideon went and lived out the rest of his days at his home in Ophrah in peace. In the tradition of the pagan Canaanites that he defeated, Gideon took many wives and concubines that ultimately produced for him 70 sons. God gave Israel rest during Gideon's lifetime. But it wasn't long before the people of Israel were prostituting themselves out to idols again. Interestingly, that golden ephod that Gideon had made ended up being the snare that caught them. And one of Gideon's own sons, by one of his concubines, helped them along. It wasn't long until the people had made Baal Berith their god, and Jerubbaal's son, by his concubine, a man named Abimelech, was up to no good.